Mission Root flips the script. We don't manage risk, we unlock potential. Mission Root was designed with purpose. We don't serve underserved, we mobilize the unestimated. The narrative shifts when we stop asking how we fix them and start asking, are they seen and how do we fuel them? ROOT stands for rebuilding our own tomorrow. And the truth is, systems label us, but people lift us.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Muhammad. Welcome to our platform.
Wa alaikum salam, Hamid. Thanks. How are you?
All is well, all is well. Thank you for once again finally helping us to make this happen.
Yes, finally.
It's been some time, but alhamdulillah, everything is good. And
Yeah.
we brought you on this platform because I feel you have an interesting program that you initiated. And it's something that I feel is a need for just a broader audience to, learn something from it and possibly can take that information and support or initiate projects that are similar. And before we talk about the programs and the systems, what personal experience or professional moments made you realize that Mission Root had to exist?
Mission Root, it really exists at that intersection of my lived experience and my professional work. I tell my story as a testimony, and I always let folks know, listen, I am not distant from trauma. So I needed many of the same services that I'm currently providing today. And I feel had I had these services in place, my journey or my outcome would have been a lot different. But then I asked myself, did it need to be different? Because it made me the person that I am today. But nonetheless, I know firsthand what it means to navigate not only instability, but stress, as well as the systems that respond too late and sometimes not at all. So for me, later working for corporate America in various institutional roles, it saddens me to say, but the reality is I sat at tables where, decisions were being made about communities, about certain zip codes, and really without those communities' best interests, right, at the center or at the heart of these models that were being developed, essentially. So, I can easily say, yes, the conversation sounded strategic professionally, but for me, my moment was realizing that there's a complete disconnect from the lived reality. And, I kept seeing families blamed for not following through when their basic needs weren't being met, or a parent, who isn't thinking about a therapy appointment if there's no food in her house. So the system wasn't really focusing on the underlying issues. And I really got tired of ultimately seeing kids being punished for survival responses, essentially, instead of being supported. So for me, Mission Root exists because healing can't, it can't begin where survival hasn't been secured, essentially. And because people, they are mostly impacted by these decisions, I feel like they deserve to be the center of everything that needs to be highlighted. And that's the whole person, the whole system.
When someone hears trauma-informed or culturally rooted, what does it look like in real life, not in theory?
It's really understanding context before judgment, particularly when you are servicing underserved or overlooked communities. So an example would be, if a mom seems short, it may be because rent is due, or if a child can't focus, it may be because their nervous system is stuck in survival mode. So trauma-informed really means we respond to what's underneath the behavior, not just what's visible on the surface. So it's the entire problem landscape, and really understanding the voice, the struggle, the context of their strength, understanding of their areas of opportunity, and also understanding what is deeply rooted, and it's the underlying issues of the survival mode.
And what would you say are the most misunderstood forms of trauma affecting underserved communities today?
I would definitely have to say chronic instability, emotional neglect. So the reality is this, right? Trauma isn't always a single violent event. It's ongoing stress. So a child who isn't focused, or a child who isn't unfocused, because it's not because he doesn't care. It's because his adverse childhood experiences, aka his trauma, essentially has trained his brain to ultimately stay alert. So trauma often looks like distraction, irritability, or shutdown. It's not always sitting in the bed. It's not always sitting in a dark room. So chronic instability and emotional neglect, I would definitely have to say, is a misunderstood form of trauma for sure.
So why do traditional mental health and social service models often fail the very communities they aim to serve?
I'm just going to say it like this, they fell because of implicit bias, and lack of cultural humility, which shape how families are ultimately treated in moments of crisis. So too often Black families, for an example, they are reduced to case files instead of being seen as people under pressure. So I've lost count, to be very honest, of how many families I've seen return to crisis units or emergency departments, not because they didn't want help, but because the first interaction caused harm. So an example of that would be, a mother comes in overwhelmed, short, or guarded, and instead of being asked, hey, what's happening? These individuals are generally labeled as uncooperative. A child who is dysregulated, instead of giving this individual support, unfortunately, they're flagged as a behavior risk or problem. So when families are ultimately treated like problems to be managed instead of people to be understood, they disengage just like any of us would, right? So, or they escalate. So for me, I'm gonna stick true to this. That's how you end up with repeat crises, right? Not because family failed the system, but ultimately because the system failed to see them. So cultural competency and humility, they're not optional in crisis work. They're the difference between healing and harm.
So it's kind of like they have a criteria or a label or just a category with a category with they where they put people in. So instead of saying, hey, you know what, let's see if we can treat this problem or treat this people or this person, they just say, hey, we're going to stick you in this category, the category of, misbehaving or this type of anger management or whatever. You know what I'm saying? I'm not sure if I'm making any sense on that, but it just remind me of like with the school system, how they're quick to give our children like Ritalin or something like that, or some type of drug to treat a hyperactive kid or a kid who just need a little bit more attention when it comes to his work. So it's kind of like that. It seems to me that that's what it seems to be.
Yeah, and to your point, the reality is it's not a luxury to be seen as a human. People it's like, okay, thanks. People tend to see, what they fear first, what they don't understand second, and the disability third, or what I describe as the ability. So when you put those things first, you take away the opportunities to do a couple of things, right? Get to know the person, to have an effective assessment or an evaluation, to really focus on strength-based and respectful resources that really, create protective factors for the individual and the family. So yes, if I'm being labeled because of how I look, then it's certainly going to be hard for me to engage. If I'm being labeled on my parenting practices because you don't understand my culture or what that may look, how that may look different from what you're used to, then yes, that is a problem. And I go back to cultural competency holds hands with humility. Like you can teach people how to engage, but if they if they don't have that human space, for me, it's always going to be a barrier when it comes to understanding people that are often misunderstood or overlooked. So if you put the label first, you miss the opportunities to understand the human first.
So what makes Mission Root structurally different from conventional nonprofits or mental health providers?
Root cause analysis. So we are not interested in band-aid fixes. Mission Root is very honed in on the underlying issues or the underlying challenges that are generally overlooked, the things that an evaluation doesn't pick up, right? Because as we just discussed, if you're not connecting with the individual, the family, or the community, you're kind of what I call parachute problem solving. You hope that you land at the right spot. It works. You write a discharge summary. There's a follow up, and hopefully, but we're different because we don't treat behavior in isolation. If a student can't focus or a youth can't focus or they're having issues at home, we don't start with discipline. We don't start with punishment. We ask the human questions. What's happening at home? What's happening at school? We ask questions like, hey, is there food insecurity? Is there housing stability? Regulation comes after stability. And when you understand that formula and that timeline, your math will math.
So more so, I see you address the trauma at a systemic and not just a individual level.
Absolutely.
So you emphasize prevention over intervention. Can you explain that a little bit more in clinical and community terms?
So Mission Root, our model is a pre-crisis prevention, early intervention model. And yes, there is a distinct difference between prevention and intervention, but they still hold hand. But where we're different, right? If I was to emphasize the difference between prevention and intervention, we lead with prevention. So intervention essentially responds after the harm, right? Prevention stabilizes families before stress turns into an example, school failure, violence, or even system involvement. So it's easier and more humane to support regulation before crisis. And that's ultimately our goal.
Just to talk a little bit about Philadelphia, we see in the news about, just the violence or the crime and everything that's going on there. And then the shocking part is that it's with a lot of youth. Like some of these kids are like
Mhm,
13, 14 years old. And for most people, you're thinking like, wait a minute, like what are you
mhm,
doing at 13 and 14-year-old walking around,
mhm,
weapons and different things of that nature. And
mhm.
how they're looked at. One thing has always been a problem for me is like they're looked at, oh, these kids are criminals, these kids this, that, they already written right off. And then you have to like say,
Immediately.
you know what I mean? So it's like you have to say to
Yeah.
yourself, like, why would a 13-year-old kid has to walk around with a gun?
Mhm,
So
mhm.
then it's like instead of saying, let me go to the origins of that, why this kid has a gun, we're automatically like, oh, this kid's a criminal, throw him away or lock him up
Right.
and, throw him under the jail. So
Right.
with your program, it's not just about trying to provide services that I see, it's more so um, building leadership skills or
Absolutely.
showing leadership skills to these.
Yes.
And what has Mission Root taught you personally about leadership and human resilience?
Well, the reality is this. I wanted to just touch base on something that you mentioned about why, I guess, why are they walking around 13 years old with weapons or they feel as though, they have to survive in this nature or this form. And, to your point, no one asks about their experiences, right? No one even asks them, what have you been through? Why are you hurting? Let's sit down, let's talk about that. If you create a portrait or a timeline of every individual or every youth engaged in a violent crime or an adverse experience, their story is going to be different, but it almost always go back to underlying trauma,
Mhm.
unaddressed issues, household dysfunction, incarceration of a parent, early exposure of dot, 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 dot. So one of the reasons why I am so highly engaged and very dedicated and committed to the overall well-being of not just youth, but their families and the communities they reside within, because they all go hand in hand. So when we are empowering youth, we also empower the family system, because you can't heal at the child level, send them back into an environment and hope that they maintain those coping skills or whatever tools that they've learned. So by really building out a system that is sustainable, a system that has protective factors and no longer risk factors, our program is also different because we really focus on not only the behavior or why the child was in survival mode, but if you almost sit down with the parent, the child is a reflection of their parent. The
Yes.
child is a reflection of the mode of the parent. And if the mother and father or the mother or the father or the caregiver is in survival mode, there's survival pressure, it cannot be relieved within the child. So a lot of what we see with our youth, there's so many variables we will have to do
Mhm.
another segment on each variables, but
Yes.
this is why I'm dedicated, because I don't see the youth as the problem. I see everything else that's not being addressed as the problem. And we're losing grip of our youth every time we look at them as a label or a problem or someone whose family needs to, slap them in the head and take them in the house. It's much more than that.
Yes. So
I'm sorry.
you're more than just putting a band-aid on a gash. You're actually
Absolutely.
treating the whole wound, patching it up, making sure you dress it and heal it properly. Instead of
Right.
like
Because
giving some kids a place to go, but then you're sending them right back to the same environment where the problem is at. Like the parents don't even have the tools or even the understanding that they have a problem. So
absolutely.
yeah, this is amazing.
Well,
This is
that goes back to ACEs, and this is why I didn't want to talk about trauma because I I get so passionate. It goes back to ACEs, adverse child experiences. I did a qualitative case study, and I wanted to fully understand the impact of adverse childhood experiences with focus on protective factors and how they influence parenting practices. And alhamdulillah, it was not only rewarding for me, but it was also rewarding for the program participants because you will be surprised how generational perpetuations or that multi-generational impact really influence how we not only see ourselves, but how we parent, how we communicate, our attitudes and our behaviors. And one of the things that I learned is that a lot of these parents don't even realize that they yell at their kids all day because their great aunts and their grandmom and their great great grandmoms communicated that way, so they essentially thought it was okay. And when we spoke to a lot of the youth, a lot of them would say, I shut down because I was being yelled at. I shut down because I didn't feel heard. I shut down because I didn't feel supported. So I transitioned to what some identify as the street level environment to look for the love, the comfort, the safety that I wasn't getting from home. So it was a groundbreaking study for the most part, but it also, again, helped not only the youth understand, their circumstance or their understanding around it, it helped the parent also understand how they wasn't making the situation any better
Mhm.
with their attitude and behavior. But for those parents who were receptive, they also realized that their trauma definitely influenced their parenting practices.
Wow. That is a yeah, that's a great deal of just self-reflection, especially as a parent. And also like going back to what you were saying about the system being humble to understand the culture, but also with us, sometimes we have our insecurities. So we
Mhm.
don't want to seem like we don't know anything, especially when it comes to not knowing ourselves in front of people. So
Mhm.
for a parent to be humble and actually just reflect, like, yeah, maybe I do have some problems.
Mhm.
Because
And
when
that
you
was
say something,
beautiful.
you hit a nerve, then they like, man, she's speaking the truth. Sometimes our
Yes.
wall go up and the defense
Yes.
come up, but then it's like once you let it down, that's when the healing starts.
But
And
that's the beauty thing about lived experience, right? I've
yes,
been through that. We didn't talk much about, my trauma or, my experiences and what I've triumphed in life. But the reality is that's one of my gifts. That's one of my abilities, alhamdulillah, is that I can communicate and engage with youth and families at a level that is relatable and not judgmental.
yes,
So when you remove the textbook theory and really understand the practicality around how to engage with the individuals who are hurting, how to engage with these families who don't trust people for whatever reasons. The system, unfortunately have failed many families and their distrust and their questioning and their paranoia around the system, it's not unusual.
yeah.
I've been there, I've done that and I had to, overcome much of, what I knew wasn't right, but really kind of shift, how can I make this right? So yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing. Like, how do you prevent burnout when your work is an immense in trauma every day?
Boundaries are everything. And while I may want to save the world, I cannot save the world overnight. I cannot save the world without a village, without support, without people. So understanding my boundaries and that self-care is not an act of cruelty. Also understanding that, team care, right? If you take care of your team, the individuals who are also first responders or at the front line of the mission, you have that synergy, right? That balance, so to speak, and really remembering that, the rest is part of resistance.
What ethical responsibility come with holding people's pain and personal stories?
Mm. Never exploit pain, okay? Trauma is real, it's not content. And I say that because one of the things that we often see um, is that pain is monetized, right? Pain is capitalized upon, pain is exploited. But pain is really not invested in, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Um, I find that it's re-traumatizing when you exploit pain, right?
Mhm.
But the reality is the ethical responsibilities for me go way beyond a person's story. It goes beyond their trust within us. It goes beyond the goal within them. It goes beyond essentially recognizing that these stories are real, these people are real. And if you have no business, if you have no business or no true desire within your intention or your heart to really help someone, never exploit their pain.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. And we see that every single day, especially within our culture. We're probably the most exploited people on this in this hemisphere. Like, and it's just a sad thing. And then we find some of us fall right in line with that, and we don't really care because like just having a conversation with somebody, you'll find out. Like what I mentioned to you before about what I find admirable about what you're doing. And from my experience working with different nonprofit organizations, and that they were pretty much out to exploit the community. They would just talk all this about, we're here, we want to change this and change that, but it was a money grab for them.
Mhm.
And for me, it was always like, I understand, you have administrative costs, you got things cost money,
Mhm.
but with them, they were more so like, I'm just trying to get a bag
Right.
and at the expense of the people who they're supposed to serve, you know. And my whole thing is like, as far as with this program, what does sustainability look like for Mission Root financially and structurally?
So our greatest impact is not the financial impact, it's the youth, family, and community impact. That is essentially what matters. So it goes back to what I said earlier, never exploit pain. Trauma is real, it's not content. If you are focusing on the financial aspect of a nonprofit organization and not the community connection or the community need, you're not going to last. Like it's not going to sell itself if there's no value or return on investment to the community or for the community. So for me, sustainability looks like a system that is for the people and understand the people. It responds in real time, in real life, and it is honed in at the intersection of real support and therapeutic. And when you have those elements, sustainability is inevitable.
If you could speak directly to a young person who feels trapped by trauma, poverty, or invisibility right now, what would you tell them in 1 minute
What would I tell them in 1 minute?
or
Okay, I
two?
feel like okay, 1 minute or two. I feel like my I'm talking to my the little version of Dr. Muhammad. So something that I always lead with is reminding you that they are not broken. Um, they're always told that they're not good at something. They're always reminded that there's some type of problem. They'll hear more about their weaknesses than their abilities and their potential. They're often hearing that they're at risk and not at potential or at rise. So I would say, dear youth, you're not broken. You were adapting, and it's okay. Your pain makes complete sense. I understand it. And your future is still yours. And with the right support, the right guidance, the right understanding, the right language, your story can change. And most importantly, you are not the sum of your experience or your past. And the future is not only yours, but you are the future. And once you recognize the power that you have underneath your feet, you will rise above not only the naysayers, but the doubts, the barriers, the hiccups, the mountains, or anything that stands before you. So you are not broken, you are whole, and you are adapting. But most importantly, you are in position to change and flourish and be the exceptional individual that you were destined to be.
Well, Dr. Muhammad, once again, we appreciate you coming on our platform. There's so much more to cover that we will in the future, inshallah, because Mission
Inshallah.
Root is definitely one of those programs that I feel is needed nationwide. I mean, you're local
Inshallah.
in Philadelphia, but this is definitely the right model. And I would love to have you back on again, inshallah.
Inshallah. And I would love to be invited back. I have so much more to say. So thank you.
Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.